that I made about the persona or personas. I thought it might be useful to revisit the subject and talk about what personas are not, because the video that I made a day or two ago was quite short, and deliberately so. What are personas not? Well, let's begin by accessing Wikipedia. Wikipedia, sometimes what's written in it is, well, probably not exactly accurate, but it is often, perhaps surprisingly, a really good source of information, particularly if you're looking for an overview and want to get a handle on some stuff that will allow you to do more research. So this is from the an article in Wikipedia which is entitled Ansel Bourne. He was or this was, Ansel Bourne was a famous psychology case. So Bourne was an evangelical preacher living in Rhode Island. He had become known slightly for his 1857 partial amnesia, in which he was seized with the idea of visiting a chapel. Up to that point, he'd been a carpenter. He published his experience in 1858. So now we get to the experience itself. On January 17th, 1887, he went to Providence, Rhode Island, then continued on until he reached Norristown, Pennsylvania, where he set up shop as a stationer and confectioner using the name A.J. Brown. On Monday, March 14th, he awakened in the morning not knowing where he was and with no memory of the preceding 2 months, still believing it was January. After he returned home with the assistance of his nephew, psychologist William James of Harvard University, that was handy, and Richard Hodgson of the Society for Psychical Research, travelled to study him. So his nephew helped, and also Richard Hodgson travelled to study him. Then, under hypnosis, they found he could be induced to assume the personality of either Bourne or Brown, and neither personality had any knowledge of the other. So this is the first ever, as far as Wikipedia is concerned anyway, and I think it's true, case or example of potential multiple personality and also amnesia and also dissociative fugue. And if you are wondering, yes, it is possible that the Jason Bourne movies use the surname Bourne because of this very famous case, amongst certain professions at least, of Ansel Bourne. And what is the persona? It's not that. it's definitely not that. It's the having a different persona or personas, or stepping into slightly different versions of ourselves, is not dissociative fugue. It is also not multiple personality disorder, or multiples, as it's sometimes called. Now, some people dispute the idea of multiple personality disorder, and other people think it is absolutely true. It is a thing. I suspect very much it is a thing, because if we can have dissociative fugue and we can have amnesia, which has been shown to be the case time and time and time again, then I'm pretty certain that a fracturing of the personality can take place. And indeed, as a matter of interest, for your delectation, in the Bourne movies there's reference to the shadowy organisation Treadstone, which probably set off a lot of alarms while me mentioning it, and this idea of trauma being induced. And I suppose the theory behind that is that if you can introduce some level of trauma, then the personality can split, and you can have these alternates, or an alternate personality. Sometimes, again, like Ansel Bourne, with no knowledge of the other. And some people suggest that isn't the case, other people suggest it is the case. But in terms of Ansel Bourne, very well researched, this does seem to be a thing. And he's not the only one. There have been cases of this since then. Amnesia can be retrograde. You know, you'll see this in the movies. Somebody has something happen to them, normally some sort of insult to the brain, and then they can't remember things before that let's say accident happened or whatever it was. And pterygrade amnesia is from a certain point, it's difficult to retain things, to store new information and ideas. So that's what it's not. That's what the persona is not. What then is it? I think that it's fair to say that it is still very much us. The idea of the persona and adopting a different persona is, as I mentioned in the video, I think, well, I wouldn't say it's the best description, but one way that I believe allows us to get a handle on it is to think about that diamond idea. And the diamond is always a diamond, it's always there, it has a presence, it has a shape, it has a scale, it has a weight, and it also has facets. And as I suggested, if we tilt the diamond towards the light, then that particular facet will be highlighted. And it's those facets of our personality, but not another personality entirely, not an alternate personality, not a dissociative fugue state, not that at all. It is still us. And therefore, I would suggest that one way to consider the diamond is that that contains, amongst other things, our beliefs and our values. And beliefs and values tend to exist for elongated periods of time. Now, I think it's also important to add that our values can shift and our beliefs can shift. Sometimes that can happen overnight because, well, something changes radically in our lives and we no longer believe in something and we no longer value something. But for most of us, most of the time, the value that we have, the value set that we have, the hierarchy of values that we hold, one perhaps or a few above all others, they tend to be relatively static. Our beliefs tend to be relatively static, but of course they can evolve and change. And so they should. As we get updated with new information, we should be open to our beliefs being malleable, at least to a degree. And our values can often change simply by the length of time that we are around on the planet. You know, what you valued when you were 10 years old may be different to what you value now, as presumably, if you're watching this, an adult. And that doesn't mean to say that there aren't core things that stay with us. I think there also very much can be core things that stay with us. Generally speaking, honesty, decency, integrity, a belief that we should do the right thing, a belief that we should take care of the vulnerable. Those tend to be relatively constant, like the personality, but it doesn't mean to say that there can't be shifts. But by and large, when I'm talking about the persona, I believe that that diamond, if it represents, in this case, values and also our beliefs, then that tends to be much more static, much more grounded than our possible shift in personas. So I'd suggest that the values that we have, the beliefs that we have, tend to be there longer term. Once more, it's not that they are immutable, not at all. It's not that they cannot change, but the change for most of us most of the time will be gradual. It will be something that we are not literally about to change overnight. It's not something very often that we do decide to change overnight, by the way. It's often because something happens. So if something does change overnight, generally speaking, there's been a fairly big event in our lives. Generally speaking, not always. So that diamond with the values, with the beliefs, will tend to be relatively stable. The persona, not that it's unstable, but the persona is more malleable. But if you imagine each of these facets, if they project out, and that's how we interface with people, with a social group, large, small, or one-to-one, it tends to be tethered in some way to the value and the beliefs, the diamond, the light that is projected, or the energy perhaps is a better way to think about it, that is projected out there is still connected to that diamond. So what we're not saying in terms of persona chess or employing a different way to look at the world and interact with the world is that we change that personality. We choose different facets of it. And perhaps another way to think about it, another layer to put in, is that when we choose that persona, well, sometimes, by the way, of course, as I mentioned in the video, we don't choose it. It can happen automatically because we've been habituated to just, oh, there's some triggers, there's that situation. We just automatically jump into, right, I'm in professional mode now, whatever that may mean. And, oh, I'm in relaxed holiday mode now, whatever that may mean. But we can also choose it. We can make that conscious choice. In my opinion, I'm pretty certain that well, at least most of us can do that. It may need awareness in the first instance to step back, consider, reflect who we're being in certain situations, how we act, and that reflection, thinking about our lives and thinking about all those contact points that we can have socially, which can be at work, it can be amongst family members, it can be one-to-one, as I've suggested. To consider who we're being is a useful exercise in of itself, because that reflection can allow us to, well, consider how we've been during the day. Were we the best friend? Were we the best boss, the best colleague, the best family member, or were we allowing things to cause us to be less than that for whatever reason? And once more, there can be different reasons for that happening. And so that reflection about who we are being, I would say, is sometimes at least best directed towards situations where we just feel that we're not getting as much out of them. We're not delivering enough. We're not leaving people in a state, in a space and place which is better than when we arrived, or at least no worse. And, I know people may not care about that. I care about that. If you're watching this, you probably care about that. And I always think it's worth just considering how we rock up to a situation. Which version of us is it? And I'll come on to, again, another way of thinking about that you may find useful. And in those interactions, to consider who we're being and how that person left. How do we think they felt? Were they crushed, demoralized, drained, upset? Or were they at least neutral, maybe feeling a little bit more buoyed up, maybe feeling energized, maybe feeling that, hey, I was valued in this conversation, I was listened to. And so I know some people will talk about personas in a different way. For me, looking at it from the angle of emotional intelligence, I think that it's important to consider, when I mention who we're being, what is our predominant emotional state or states in that moment. And let's imagine it's a meeting. So this could be a work meeting. It could be a meeting with a friend or an acquaintance. I often think it's worthwhile doing a bit of a check of self in terms of emotions. How am I feeling right now? I'm running late, I'm a bit exasperated, I'm irritated because I thought of the thing this person said last week, or I'm irritated because of what somebody told me about them. And one could argue that that's fair enough. Just go into that interaction, just be like that. Maybe you need that type of energy. Maybe it's important to be a bit irritated. Maybe it's important to be a bit annoyed. Most of the time, I don't think that is a good way for us to conduct ourselves, but it is inevitable because none of us are perfect. And also, what is resourceful in terms of emotional state or states, I believe depends on the outcome that we want, and also it is connected, of course, to what we believe and our values. And maybe the interaction we're about to have with someone is fueled, that irritation in this case is fueled by the fact that we believe, in terms of our value set and potentially our belief set, that this individual was way out of order. And so that irritation could be at least understood, maybe even warranted. But most of the time, for most of us, I think it is important, if we possibly can, to be in as upbeat a mood as possible. That doesn't necessarily mean laughing uproariously and giggling. I don't mean that. What I mean in terms of being upbeat is calm, thoughtful, perhaps having an element of curiosity. Those are great emotions to have and to experience. And maybe also an element of frivolity, an element of being perhaps on the verge of laughter. That could be appropriate. I'm not saying we can conjure that up every time, but certainly being curious, certainly being thoughtful, certainly getting into listening mode, being calm, being more receptive can be really useful. And so if we check who we are before we get there, and in real time, because it can be done, as long as we haven't reached any emotional tipping point that I'll talk about, then in the moment, as things are happening, as that action is happening, we can say to ourselves, how am I being right now? Is that a bit of irritation that I feel popping up? Why is it there? Name it. Allow it to drift away, if you want it to, of course, and step back into, what can I learn? I'm curious. What can I glean from this conversation? And that emotional awareness, that emotional regulation as opposed to dysregulation, can help us and can also help engender a meeting, an interaction which is as enriching as it can be. Once more, I add, from a place of extreme imperfection, that I don't always do that, and you probably don't always do that either. But I also don't think that this is some fantasy, that it is impossible to consider who we're being and what those predominant emotional states are. I'm certain it isn't. I've done it, and I know that I can do it, and I know other people can do it, and I've talked to and taught some people some of this stuff, and they come back and tell me, yeah. But are we perfect? Will it happen all the time? No. And so what's that got to do with persona? Well, the emotions that we're experiencing can drive very much our thinking, or can at least influence us to say things or to look at an individual through a particular lens. And that different set of hues that we can look at someone through based on those emotions can cause our interactions to change. And maybe it can become that virtuous cycle, or perhaps they can spiral downwards. And generally speaking, that's not a good thing. This doesn't mean to say that we shouldn't defend ourselves. It doesn't mean to say that we should allow people to walk over us. It doesn't mean to say that we shouldn't call people out, because we should, when it is appropriate. I'm talking about, by and large, where do you want to exist? Where do I want to exist? I want to exist more often than the opposite in those more upbeat emotions, to be curious, to be interested, to have an element of humour or fun in the mix, or just below the surface. I think it's healthier for all of us. But will we always exist there? No. Will we dip into other more negative emotions? Then absolutely. And it could be that, as I've suggested already, is understandable and maybe what is required in some interactions. Of course, it may be. And I think it's Barbara Fredrickson who talks about, I think she's Harvard, who talks about a ratio of something like 2 to 1. So two, two times more the more upbeat emotions, as I'll call them here for the sake of some shorthand, as opposed to 1. So even though we dip into those more negative emotions, like being a bit anxious, being a bit annoyed, etc., which serve their purpose, they're there for a reason. But it's just that if we're there all the time, they can become bad for us physically and mentally. But for peak performance, I believe that the ratio in terms of Barbara's work is something like 5 to 1, 5 more upbeat to 1 negative. And that can't always be the case for us because a lot of stuff can happen in our lives. And I've certainly seen me in situations where it's been the inverse of that. It's like 5 negative to 1, occasionally upbeat. But then to come back to what is this got to do with a persona? Well, if the persona is anchored to our beliefs and values, knowing that they can shift over time, but are much more static than our personas for most of us, most of the time, then those will influence and tether us back to them when we adopt a certain persona. Because if we, let's say, for example, you believe that privacy is important and you decide to adopt a persona of someone who thinks that everything should be open, all communications, every government should be able to look at everything that's going on all the time, then it could well come across as fake because people aren't stupid. And even though they might not consciously pick it up, subconsciously, they're getting a feeling that something isn't quite right. They're getting that feeling because the words don't match the other cues and clues like tonality, micro expressions, body language, and maybe literally the language that is being used. That would be fake. That wouldn't be dissociative fugue, and it certainly wouldn't be amnesia, and it's not multiple personality. It's just us pretending, and we're pretending too far away from our values and our beliefs. We're too far removed. We've untethered ourselves from the diamond. We're putting on an act. And I appreciate sometimes we've got to do that. And I appreciate that you've probably done it. I've certainly done it. But it's never a long-term solution and it's uncomfortable. And I think it's something that is very difficult to keep up. And if you've done that, you just don't feel right afterwards. But socially, it is something that maybe we have to do with good reason, for good outcome. But long term and as a habit, absolutely not. Nobody wins with that. It's important for us to be truthful and honest, or as truthful and honest as we possibly can. Then there's a dichotomy sometimes between, well, how much should I say because I'm going to hurt this person's feelings? And that's perhaps a different conversation for another time about ethics and morals and do no harm. But for the sake of this little canter over personas, I would suggest that our persona is still anchored to our values and our beliefs. And that being the case, then it is important to recognize that when we adopt a persona, yes, we may emphasize certain things about our personality. We may switch on an interest that is there. We may even at times exaggerate how interested we are, but we don't make it up. It isn't from nothing. There's something there. But I would say overall, a really important component of the persona is or are those emotional states that I mentioned, which is why I'm mentioning them, because our emotional states, as I've already said, can cause us to look at things and interact in a different way. And I mentioned like this, or this idea, or alluded to it about the tipping point when strong emotions take over. Let's imagine negative ones, so-called negative, like anger, then we'll say things and do things that really isn't us. And that's not a persona, it's not an act, it's us just being overpowered by some base emotions. And that being the case, we're probably not going to get the outcome that we want. Having said that, there are situations where anger is appropriate and it may save us or someone else. But by and large, in normal social interactions day to day, it's probably not a good place or space to be in. And it's also not good for us to be angry long term, because it damages us psychologically, it's maladaptive, and also it damages us or can damage us physically in things like blood pressure, etc. So the emotional state or states we should be aware of. Then, to begin to draw this to a conclusion, I would suggest that when we then think about the persona, one way to shift it is to use our emotions. And what I mean by that is, let's just say that the last few times on reflection, when you've thought about it, an interaction with someone has been a little bit fractious. When you consider what you were doing, is it because you adopted, this is purely an example, is it because you adopted I want to be right, I'm in intellectual mode, and this individual is potentially challenging my intellectual capacity or what I think about this particular subject, and it ended up not great. Very often, particularly if you are taking the time to listen to this video and probably therefore do reflect upon yourself and do want to improve your lot in life, as I do, then sometimes somebody's got to be the bigger person. In other words, just not be not be driven by some of these baser emotions, like, you know, I need to sort of stamp my authority on this person. I need them to know I'm right. I need them to see that they're not right. And maybe that could be something that has to happen at some point. But by and large, is there a different way to do it? And I would suggest, yes, there is. And one of the ways we can do that is to be curious, is to sit with this individual, and this is in this example, and figure out, what do they know that we don't? And to be open, and to have a little bit of humour in there as well. To listen wryly, perhaps, as someone else gives us their opinion that we might not agree with, but to notice the passion about them, to notice that, well, what are they saying in actual fact? Because normally I just cut this person off and I come in with my point. And even although we might hear ourselves say, well, I don't believe in that, well, what is there in there that could be of use? And maybe ask some supplementary questions, get this individual to say a bit more about that subject. And it is just possible, and it has happened, and it does happen, that we may find things in there that we hadn't thought about. And whilst we might not radically change our opinion, but that could happen, perhaps it is altered or softened a little bit. But the outcome in this imagined example is a much more beneficial discourse, and the individual walks away feeling that they've been heard. And we may even end up in a situation, you've probably heard this before, that I'll have to finish this off because I think the battery is going to go in a minute. That we might find ourselves in a situation where we say something like, well, we're going to have to agree to disagree. And that can be said with great rancor, with annoyance, and maybe even anger. But it can be said with a wry smile and an acknowledgement that this person, this individual, is different from us, that they have a different perspective, but it's interesting nonetheless. And so we don't move away from our values of being anything but supportive where possible. We don't move away from our values that we don't want to knowingly create harm to another person or distress. We don't move away from our belief that other people should be heard. So we're anchored, we're tethered to the diamond, but our persona is a little bit different from the one that could have been projected out there, to the one that would go, no, I'm right, you've got to listen to me, because I believe that what I'm saying is important. And my belief is that this subject is something which I know a lot about. And so that belief can still be there. Hopefully you can see this, that that belief can still be there, but we allow our belief and our value set about being polite and decent to people and not causing undue stress where possible. We allow that to exist by adopting the persona, which again can include a few other facets too, of course, but we adopt that persona driven by a curious mindset, an interested emotion, a listening persona rather than a telling persona. And of course, we're all different, and the many different situations that we can find ourselves in mean that as I suggested in the first video about the persona, that the differences can be subtle. But it's very interesting, I believe, when you play about with it and just try thinking about who you're being emotionally before getting into a situation and during it, and saying to yourself, is this the best version of me based on the outcome that I want from this? Again, presuming that the outcome in this example that I've been talking about is conviviality, it's peace, it's exploration, it's a sharing of ideas. Now, will that mean that we never get annoyed? Will that mean that we'll always be perfect and won't be reactive? Absolutely not. And does thinking about the persona mean that we won't fly off the handle one day because we just drop right into anger because something happens? Absolutely not. Some people say that they're not like that and they never get angry, they don't fly off the handle. Well, I'm not one of them. Again, I'm not perfect. I think one of the reasons I'm interested in this area, perhaps the same as you, is because I want to improve, and I'm not perfect by any stretch of the imagination in almost any area of my life. In fact, I don't think in any area of my life. Yes, definitely not perfect in any of it. And I'm keen always to make the most of any social interaction. And I'm also aware that sometimes I absolutely don't. So this idea about predominant emotional states and linking that to a persona, you may find useful, but also I'd suggest it's best done after a bit of reflection and a bit of trying it out, and to consider who you're being. Remember, that can be the persona. You might give it a name, but it can also mean predominant emotional states or state. And the way we can do that, just to finish off, is by something called the observing self. That little voice inside your head that says, there you go again, shut up, don't say that, take a little bit of a step back, walk away now. Well, if you've ever experienced that little voice, then you'll know it's real. And as I've suggested, it is called, by some people at least, the observing self. And we can also use that as we're interacting in real time, but not all the time. It tends to just dip in and out, and it's up to us then to be conscious of our states and to be, as I've suggested in this example, as curious as possible rather than as dogmatic as possible. Steering, guiding, mentoring, as I said in the video, rather than immediately going for the counter punch when someone says something. And I've done all of the wrong things, and sometimes I've done the right things. And I think it is, for me at least, work in progress. But I hope you find that useful, and I better switch this off before it decides to just go kaput. Anyway, I don't think there was any questions that came up. If they did, sorry, I didn't see them. Nothing came up on the screen. But for the moment, from me, anyway, bye for now. Thanks.